AAA gaming. What do we think of the term when it comes to AAA? We think of those games that take advantage of the power of current hardware, those games that are going to push the boundaries of the industry as we know it. Whenever you see a massive game get revealed during Summer Game Fest, the Game Awards, or even any of the big three's platform showcases, you just know that the scale of those games is going to wow you. You'd think that video games could never get better than seeing the amount of monsters you could kill in Monster Hunter Wilds, or seeing those iconic blades in Wolverine's knuckles. Even today's releases are just blowing us away to some degree. I recently played Final Fantasy 16 and my jaw dropped the entire time having to fight what would possibly be one of my favourite boss fights of all time. Throughout the 2010s, AAA gaming has been subject to some of the worst practices and business models introduced in the industry. Loot boxes, downgrades to visuals just to fit the hardware limits of the consoles at the time, and even releasing games that are just outright buggy and broken, with developers resorting to patches to fix the rot and bad word of mouth surrounding those games. And the biggest problem from AAA gaming, it just does not seem to take risks, and particularly from Western AAA studios, we seem to get more of the same kinds of games that we've come to expect at this point. Back in the day, it used to be generic military shooters trying to one-up Call of Duty. Now it's just empty open-world games that just fail to respect your time as a gamer, of course. But now in 2024, and as we've seen in 2023, there's a human and an economic cost to AAA game development. Last year was the worst for developers being laid off and trying to find a new studio to land back on their feet in the industry, and we're already starting to see a problem that was talked about a little bit over the last few years, but it's now something that no one can ignore at this point. The cost of developing massive AAA games is now at a point where it's just out of control, and that's what I want to talk about in this video.
I read on the internet that our games have had a few bugs. I did.
So, it's just pretty obvious at this point that AAA development is not only difficult, it's incredibly costly as well. We were hearing stories of development costs rising at the start of every generation. Back in 1997, when Final Fantasy VII released, the incredible FMVs they used at the time set Square back like a total of $45 million. So yeah, it was an incredibly polished game that made really good use of the technology at the time. And I'm not going to forget the cost of Sega trying to make Shenmue. I think that game was supposed to be a Virtua Fighter RPG back on the Saturn, and it gradually evolved into an open world game on the Dreamcast. And yeah, it cost $70 million. It was a huge risk to make back then. And for a game that was released so early in the Dreamcast's lifespan, it looked really good visually. Since Sega invested so much money onto Shenmue, it's kinda sad that it never really poured in the numbers for the company, because it was a groundbreaking game for its time, right? And it definitely didn't help the Dreamcast, which by that point, it was just dead in the water. Because video games were becoming more complex over time, development costs for games, they were all steadily going up, and because each new console per generation has new technology for developers to take advantage of, we were getting games that felt more immersive than the ones that came out for previous consoles. Let's take Metal Gear Solid for example, one of the best games of its era and of all time. For a game released during the era of the PS1, where developers were experimenting with deeper narratives and story elements and interactive 3D worlds, it looked fantastic. But you jump in a couple of years later when the PS2 launched, and we get Metal Gear Solid 2. That game only cost $10 million, but going from MGS1 to that was a massive leap for everything across the board. Visuals, physics, production values. I'm still kinda shocked that for everything the game did, it cost only $10 million. Maybe it's a good example as to why a bigger budget doesn't always mean better. When you really think about it, it kinda makes the situation with AAA and its development budgets more obvious. Ever since the 7th generation of consoles, development budgets have started to balloon out of control. The new technology was allowing for more detailed visuals, physics, new effects to use during gameplay, and experimenting with new gameplay mechanics that wouldn't have been possible on older hardware, and the biggest one of course, the cost of creating games around the HD standard. There were tons of developers who were either stuck with the aging PS2 hardware, they had to scale their games down to the Wii or even to the PSP and DS at the time, or they just closed down completely. Only some of the biggest and most well-funded developers and publishers could really take advantage of what the PS3 and the Xbox 360 had to offer back then. Games like Gran Turismo 5 and Gears of War 3 would cost up to $60 million to develop for, alongside longer development times, and it's only gotten up there since. Except now, it's at an out of control level compared to what we had a decade or so ago. It's also fair to point out that with a AAA budget, developers and publishers are kind of being put in the corner. They have to develop games based on what's popular in the market. Let's take Activision for example. They are a COD factory, and they literally will churn out COD every year because they're confident that it sells. People see it as the go-to cookie cutter shooter each year, and not to mention, they can make back the money even further after the initial release. Back then it was DLC map packs, nowadays it's cosmetic bundles being sold for $20 a pop. It's a hard pill to swallow, but the focus on AAA also means trying to make those games look flashier to a lot of people as the industry has grown year on year, and it also heightens those expectations both from investors and consumers alike. It sadly means minimizing as much risk as possible. Remember back in the PlayStation 2 era where every developer was just going hard at it with a good balance on visuals and art style and new gameplay ideas that just didn't break the bank? Nowadays, you need to have a return on investment for those big games, and taking a risk of something new is somewhat tough for most AAA developers. Out of last year's games, Immortals of Avian was a good example of this, right? New IP, looked flashy, and it was a debut game from a studio with experienced devs across the board from AAA. It didn't even break even on its development cost. The Insomniac hack is also a good example of this. This kinda opened up the door to a lot more of an understanding when it comes down to games costing so much to develop for, and it sung the alarm bells on AAA investing so much on development, marketing, headcount, everything. Spider-Man on PS4 cost $100 million to develop for. It's absolutely unreal that its sequel cost $350 million to develop for over the course of 5 years. God of War Ragnarok, The Last of Us Part 2, and Horizon Forbidden West, they cost $200 million each. Halo Infinite's total development cost was speculated to be close to $500 million. Those games took around 4 to 5 years to go from pre-production all the way to being shipped on retail. I don't get just how these games are commanding those insane development costs, because I'm sure it's not sustainable, right?
Where were you? Photographing squirrels? You're fired.
Chief, the planetarium party.
Oh, right. You're unfired. I need you. Come here.
There is a real economic cost to all of this. With bigger games, it requires a bigger workforce to put in the heavy lifting over the course of a couple of years, right? From reading some of the documents about Spider-Man 2's development, about 380 people were involved in creating it over the course of 5 years. That's an insane number. If you thought that wasn't big enough, 3,000 developers across most of Activision studios work on Call of Duty every single year. But let's go back to Insomniac. 380 people working on one game in 5 years is astounding. By comparison, let's take Ratchet & Clank, the very first one developed for the PS2. It took 20 months for that game to develop for, and at its peak, it had 45 people working on it. Now, there's a big pattern. The more complex these projects become, the more expensive it is to develop for, and then you need a bigger headcount of developers to work with. And it seems like it's only going to go up at the current rate of where AAA is headed to. Which leads on to the next point, the costs being pushed onto consumers. With games costing that much to make, it just comes as like no surprise that the industry moved to $70 games this generation. Back in the 5th and the 6th generation console lifecycle, you could pay $50 or £40 for a new game, sometimes it would be cheaper. The 7th generation console saw that change to $60 or £50 to account for the growing development costs of games, and a move to HD, and that asking price was still there when we got the PS4 and the Xbox One. This generation though, we got a price increase to $70 or £70. We as consumers now have to think carefully and what games we pay for, because right now we are not in a good state economically.
I am a fighter and not a quitter.
And this goes right back to developers who know that they cannot afford to go over budget with their projects and they have to make a profit. I feel like it's part of the reason why we've gotten so many layoffs within the industry, and it's not an easy thing to go through. With game development becoming more expensive on the AAA front, publishers think that the easy way to control the costs is through cutting the headcount on their studios so as to not go over budget or lose money on their games. 2023 was a fucking disaster for video game jobs, and it's looking like this year will be even worse. Judging from what's happened to Unity and Twitch, we're only barely just crossed 2 weeks into 2024, and I'd hate to imagine just how much worse it's gonna be.
And I've got to say, in all honesty, it's the biggest piece of dog shit that I have ever heard.
I just think that the AAA industry is in for a rude awakening. As it continues to become even more unsustainable for most developers, we're going to see a point where making those games is far too expensive for most to really put years on developing. I think the likes of Rockstar and Activision could afford to do this because it's obvious that GTA and Call of Duty are infinite money spinners, but what about the rest? I strongly believe that a lot of these massive AAA games, the way that they're going, especially in the West, they're going to hit a point where the budgets are not going to break even. Expectations are going to be so high from the amount of money being spent on these games that they're going to end up bombing from falling behind those expectations commercially. And we have to ask ourselves a serious question, right? Why are we spending so much money on these big ass games that are just becoming more and more expensive to make? Have we actually conditioned ourselves into expecting more and more to the point where it's become extremely unsustainable? Instead of trying to spend years trying to make games look bigger, why not realize that bigger isn't always better? Look at games like Spider-Man Miles Morales or Uncharted The Lost Legacy. Those games are so much smaller in terms of their scale, and they still retain those insanely good production values. I think that going for shorter, tightly focused experiences, they don't cost the earth. Not everything has to be bigger and better when you could make a game that might be short but could offer you lots of replay value easily. This is where a lot of the indies, AA's and Japanese AAA succeed where others fail. They are efficient, they're making use of whatever assets they can use, and they don't have to spend extra development time trying to make whole new assets, animations, stuff like that for their future games. The Yakuza games are like a great example of this, and Nintendo's games have their extra polish that's still present throughout their titles. Efficiency is key here. And one other thing I'd probably mention, it would be nice if developers went with a more distinctive art style with their games and didn't try too hard to go the extra mile with realism. Just kinda a thought, but some of the best games of all time didn't need an uber expensive budget to get its appeal across. Maybe the AAA industry should take note of this at least one day. But yes, this is the end of the video. A lot of people have been talking about development costs going up, especially in the AAA realm, but we're now at a point where it's going to backfire on almost all of Western AAA the way it's going. There needs to be a bigger discussion, a bigger debate on how much money is going towards these games and whether scaling down is worth it in the long term, which I feel has way more of those benefits. The AAA bubble might burst one day, but this was a topic that I felt was interesting enough to talk about, and one that's only going to get way more attention in the near future. Thank you so much for watching this video. As always, if you enjoyed it, please like, comment or subscribe to the channel, it's really appreciated. And if you want to, you can join the Discord or follow my Twitter in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.